Princess Chrysalis stood motionless before the towering crystal window of her private chambers, her iridescent scales reflecting the soft light of 3 moons hanging in the purple sky of Hexadia Prime. Her long fingers traced patterns on the cold surface as she counted, for the 100th time that day, the number of qualifications she had achieved. 17 forms of quantum physics, she whispered to herself, her secondary breathing gills fluttering in frustration. 4 new trade agreements. Combat mastery in 3 forms of ritual combat. And still not enough. The morning's events played over in her mind. She had stood before the Imperial Council, presenting her latest achievement, the successful negotiation of peace between 2 warring mineral-rich systems. Any other noble would have been celebrated for such an accomplishment, but she wasn't any other noble. She was the heir to the Hexadian Empire, and her mother, Empress Inxbera, demanded perfection. Your approach was too calculated, her mother had said, those famous golden eyes showing no emotion. You solved the problem, yes, but you failed to demonstrate true understanding of leadership. Chrysalis' tail twitched in annoyance at the memory. True understanding of leadership. The same phrase over and over, with no explanation of what it actually meant. She had asked her teachers, studied ancient texts, even consulted with the wisdom keepers of the outer colonies. Nobody could tell her what she was missing. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Your Highness, her personal AI assistant spoke through the room's communication system. Your evening schedule requires attention. Chrysalis turned from the window, her ceremonial robes sweeping across the polished floor. Display schedule, she commanded. A holographic display materialized in the center of the room. She had 3 more tasks to complete before sleep cycle. Review the new educational protocols for the colony worlds, prepare for tomorrow's Energy Distribution Council, and complete her daily combat training. She moved to her desk, crafted from rare metals found only in the heart of dying stars, and began reviewing the educational protocols. Each word she read reminded her of her own endless education. Decades of learning, proving, achieving. She was 300 years old now, well past the traditional age of succession, yet still deemed unprepared for the throne. A movement caught her eye. Her reflection in the desk's polished surface. She looked every bit the perfect Hexadian royal. Tall, elegant with scales that shifted colors with her movements, and the distinctive golden eyes of the royal bloodline. But something was missing, something her mother saw, or rather, didn't see, every time she looked at her daughter. Computer, she said suddenly, display the requirements for succession as written in the ancient laws. The text appeared before her. The heir must demonstrate mastery of sciences, arts, and combat. They must prove their diplomatic abilities and show wisdom in governance. Above all, they must display true understanding of leadership. Chrysalis' tail lashed in frustration. There it was again, that same phrase as unclear as ever. She had mastered everything that could be mastered, learned everything that could be learned. What more could there possibly be? She didn't know it then, but the answer would come from the most unlikely source. A species that the Hexadian Empire had only recently discovered, a species that many of her people still viewed as primitive and unsophisticated, a species called human. But for now, she turned back to her work, determined to prove herself worthy, even if she had to spend another 300 years trying. After all, she was Chrysalis, heir to the Hexadian Empire, and she would never, ever give up. The grand reception hall of the Imperial Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 floating crystals. Princess Chrysalis stood at her mother's right hand, watching as diplomats from across the galaxy filed in to celebrate the Empire's 10,000th year. Her scales were polished to perfection, showing no sign of her sleepless nights spent preparing for this event. Species number 37 approaching, the court announcer's voice echoed. Ambassador Sarah Chen of Earth. Chrysalis' attention shifted to the entrance. She had studied Earth's files extensively. A young civilization that had achieved faster than light travel only 50 years ago. By Hexadian standards, they were barely more than children. The human ambassador walked in, And immediately, something went wrong. Instead of the traditional 45-degree bow, Sarah Chen tripped on her ceremonial robe. The entire court held their breath, waiting for the inevitable crash. But it never came. The human somehow turned her stumble into a graceful spin, ending in a bow that, while not perfect, had a unique flair to it. "Well, that's one way to make an entrance," Sarah said with a laugh, her voice carrying through the shocked silence. "I promise I'm better at diplomacy than dancing." Crizella watched in fascination as something unprecedented happened. The stern-faced Hexadian nobles, known for their rigid protocol, actually smiled. A few even made sounds that could be classified as chuckles, a rare occurrence in the imperial court. As the evening progressed, Crizella found herself drawn to the human ambassador's strange behavior. Sarah used the wrong fork for the mineral course, but turned it into a discussion about Earth's varying dining customs. She mispronounced several Hexadian words, but her genuine attempts and good humor about her mistakes seemed to endear her to even the most traditional nobles. During the anti-gravity dance portion of the evening, Crizella finally approached Sarah, who was watching the floating dancers with obvious delight. "Ambassador Chen," Crizella said formally, "your approach to diplomacy is unusual." Sarah turned, her eyes twinkling. "Is that a polite way of saying I'm doing everything wrong, Your Highness?" "You've broken 17 different protocols in the past 2 hours," Crizella stated. "Yet nobody seems offended. How is this possible?" Sarah shrugged, another informal gesture that should have been inappropriate but somehow wasn't. Sometimes the best way to connect with people is to show them you're real. Perfect can be pretty, but imperfect can be interesting. Crizella's head scales shifted in confusion. But perfection is the goal of all things. It is what we strive for. "Is it, though?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the dancers above. "Look at them. Each pair moves differently. If they all danced exactly the same way, would it be as beautiful?" Before Crizella could respond, a minor noble floated down incorrectly and bumped into several others. Instead of the expected embarrassment and shame, Sarah started clapping. "Now that's what I call mixing things up," she called out cheerfully. Surprisingly, others joined in the applause. Crizella watched as the noble, instead of being humiliated, gave a playful bow and rejoined the dance with renewed enthusiasm. Something stirred in her mind, a question she had never thought to ask before. Looking at Sarah Chen's smiling face, Crizella made a decision. "Ambassador," she said carefully, "would you be willing to meet with me privately tomorrow? I find myself curious about human perspectives." Sarah's smile grew wider. "Your Highness, I would be honored. And I promise to try not to break anything important during our chat." For the first time in a very long while, Crizella felt herself smiling back. Crizella paced in her private study, her scales shifting between shades of blue and gray, colors of frustration in Hexadian culture. The morning's evaluation for the throne had gone poorly again. The council had praised her knowledge but found her lacking in that same mysterious quality, true understanding of leadership. A soft chime announced Sarah Chen's arrival. The human ambassador entered, carrying a small device Crizella recognized as an Earth tablet. "You seem troubled, Your Highness," Sarah said, settling into a chair that adjusted to her non-Hexadian form. "I failed another evaluation," Crizella admitted. "I don't understand. I answered every question perfectly. My solutions to their scenarios were flawless." Sarah tilted her head. "Maybe that's the problem. Do you mind if I show you something?" The tablet came to life, displaying images of human leaders throughout Earth's history. "This is Abraham Lincoln," Sarah explained, showing a bearded human male. "He failed in business twice, lost 8 elections, and had a nervous breakdown before becoming one of our greatest presidents." Crizella's head scales flattened in confusion. "Why would you celebrate someone who failed so many times?" "Because he learned from each failure. Watch this." Sarah played a video showing Lincoln's journey, his mistakes, and how he grew from them. She showed how he used his experiences to lead during Earth's greatest crisis. More images followed. Winston Churchill, who made terrible mistakes in one war, but led brilliantly in another. Nelson Mandela, who spent years in prison before emerging to heal a nation. Marie Curie, who failed countless experiments before her breakthrough discoveries. But these are all examples of imperfection, Crizella protested. In the Empire, such failures would disqualify someone from leadership. Sarah smiled gently. Yet each of these leaders changed their world for the better. They succeeded not despite their failures, but because of what those failures taught them. Crizella moved to her crystal window, thinking. In my last evaluation, they asked how I would handle a food shortage on a colony world. I provided a perfect distribution plan, accounting for every variable. And what did they say? They said I missed something crucial, but wouldn't explain what. Crizella's tail twitched in remembered frustration. Sarah stood up, joining her at the window. Let me ask you something. In your perfect plan, did you consider how it would feel to be the people receiving that food? Did you think about their fears, their need for hope as much as sustenance? Crizella stared at the human, her golden eyes widening. I know. I focused on efficiency. Perfect logistics. Sometimes perfect isn't what people need, Sarah said softly. Sometimes they need a leader who understands their struggles, who's faced challenges themselves. But I've never. Crizella stopped, understanding dawning. I've never truly struggled. Everything I've done has been carefully planned to avoid failure. Sarah nodded. And how can you lead people through their failures if you've never faced your own? Crizella sat down heavily, her scales shifting to a thoughtful green. All my life, I've tried to be perfect. But perhaps that's why I can't understand true leadership. I've never allowed myself to learn from mistakes. It's never too late to start, Sarah said, placing the tablet down. The question is, are you brave enough to risk being imperfect? Crizella looked at the images of human leaders, flawed, failed, yet ultimately triumphant. For the first time, she saw not a record of shame, but a path to wisdom. Teach me, she said simply. Sarah's smile widened. Lesson 1. Sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is admit they need to learn. Red warning lights flashed across the Imperial Command Center screens. Princess Crizella stood with the emergency response team, watching as an enormous ion storm approached the colony world of Vigthor. Her mother, Empress Nxbera, had already initiated the Empire's standard evacuation protocols. Everything is proceeding according to plan, the colony governor reported through the holographic display. All citizens are following the designated evacuation routes to their assigned shelters. Crizella frowned, something about the governor's tone bothering her. She glanced at Sarah Chen, who had been invited to observe as part of her diplomatic duties. The human was squinting at the weather patterns displayed on the main screen. That storm's changing direction, Sarah said quietly, only for Crizella's hearing. Moments later, alarms blared. The ion storm had suddenly shifted, moving 3 times faster than predicted. The perfect evacuation plan, designed for the storm's original path, was now useless. Maintain order, Empress Nxbera commanded. Recalculate new routes based on standard protocols. But Crizella saw the panic spreading on the colony's live feeds. People were running from the designated routes as purple lightning split the sky. The storm was destroying the carefully planned escape paths, and the backup routes would take too long to compute. She thought of her lessons with Sarah about human leaders during crisis. Sometimes, Sarah had said, you have to throw away the perfect plan and work with what you have. Crizella made her decision. She grabbed the command center's communication controls, breaking at least 3 royal protocols. Citizens of Vigthor, she broadcast, her voice reaching every public channel. This is Princess Crizella. The storm has changed course. Forget the evacuation routes. Look around you. If you see higher ground, go there. If you see a sturdy building, use it. Help each other. Share vehicles. Don't wait for perfect solutions. Just get to safety. The command center fell silent. No one had ever contradicted an imperial evacuation plan before. Kurzalla's scales paled as her mother stared at her, but she continued. "I'm sending the palace guard to help," she announced. "Another broken protocol. They'll have atmospheric shields. If you're stranded, signal them with anything you have. Lights, sounds, even shouting. We'll find you." She turned to the stunned guard captain. "Go. Forget formation flying. Spread out and save everyone you can find." The captain looked at the Empress, then at Kurzala. Something in the princess's golden eyes must have convinced him. He saluted and ran to mobilize his troops. What followed was chaos, but productive chaos. Citizens helped each other climb to safety. Guards swooped down to rescue families from rooftops. Store owners broke protocols to shelter strangers. It wasn't orderly, it wasn't perfect, but it was working. 3 hours later, the storm passed. The command center received the final numbers. Thousands saved, with casualties far below what they would have been under the original plan. Kurzala stood before her mother, awaiting punishment for her actions. The Empress's face was unreadable. "You broke 17 different protocols," Vera said finally. "You abandoned centuries of tested evacuation procedures. You encouraged disorder." She paused. "And you saved more lives than our perfect plan would have." Kurzala lifted her chin. Sometimes imperfect actions serve people better than perfect plans. To everyone's shock, Empress Vera's scales shifted to a color Kurzala had never seen on her mother before, the deep gold of approval. Sarah, watching from the corner, smiled quietly. The princess had just learned something no protocol could teach. Sometimes leadership meant having the courage to break the rules. 3 days after the Ion storm, Princess Kurzala sat in her private garden, preparing herself for what she expected would be a severe punishment. The morning's news feeds were filled with stories about her actions during the crisis. She had broken protocols, disrupted order, encouraged chaos, everything the Hexadian royal was taught never to do. A soft chime announced Sarah's arrival. The human ambassador carried 2 cups of what Kurzala recognized as Earth tea. "Have you seen the latest reports from Vexthor?" Sarah asked, offering 1 cup to the princess. "I've been avoiding them," Kurzala admitted, her scales shifting to a nervous purple. "I assume they're full of criticism about my handling of the crisis." Sarah's smile widened. "You might want to take a look." She activated her tablet, and holographic images filled the air around them. Kurzala watched in amazement as recordings played from the colony. Citizens were sharing stories, not of chaos and disorder, but of survival and unity. "The princess told us to help each other," one colonist said, scales glowing with emotion. "My neighbor's vehicle carried 3 families to safety. In the old protocols, we weren't supposed to share emergency transport." Another recording showed a young Hexadian. "When the storm changed direction, we were trapped. The princess said to signal with anything we had. We used cooking pots to make noise. The guards found us because they were actually looking, not just following preset search patterns." More stories followed. A shop owner who broke storage protocols to shelter 50 people. Guards who abandoned formation flying to reach trapped families. Citizens who worked together instead of waiting for official instructions. "The people are calling you something new," Sarah said softly. "The people's princess." Kurzala's scales flushed with embarrassment. "But I failed to maintain order. I encouraged chaos." "Did you?" Sarah challenged. "Or did you trust your people to be their best selves in a crisis? Look at the numbers. Your chaotic response saved more lives than any perfect plan could have." A new message flashed on the tablet. Kurzala's scales paled. "The Imperial Council wants to see me." "Go," Sarah encouraged. "Show them what you've learned." In the council chamber, Kurzala faced the assembled elders and her mother. But instead of the punishment she expected, she found something very different. "We have reviewed the events on Vexthor," the head elder spoke. "Your actions were unprecedented, unplanned, imperfect." He paused, "and they revealed something we have never seen before." Empress Vera stood. "You showed us that true leadership isn't about maintaining perfect order. It's about adapting when order fails, about trusting our people instead of just commanding them. But I broke so many protocols, Chrysalis said. Yes, her mother replied. And in doing so, you proved something I've waited 300 years to see. You showed that you understand what leadership truly means. Chrysalis' scales shifted in surprise. I don't understand. Perfect plans fail, daughter. Perfect leaders fail. What matters is how we face those failures and help our people through them. For the first time, Chrysalis saw tears in her mother's eyes. You finally learned what I could never teach you. You learned to lead with your heart as well as your mind. As Chrysalis left the chamber later, she found Sarah waiting. So, the human asked, what did you learn? Chrysalis looked at her friend, her scales now shining with confidence. I learned that being a perfect leader isn't about being perfectly right. It's about being perfectly willing to be wrong, to learn, and to trust your people. Sarah smiled. Now that sounds like true understanding of leadership to me. The imperial palace buzzed with excitement and confusion. In the main audience chamber, Princess Chrysalis was doing something no royal had ever done before. She was holding an open forum with common citizens. The grand golden walls, usually reserved for noble ceremonies, now echoed with the voices of merchants, workers, and colonists. Your Highness, a mineral miner spoke up, his work-worn scales dulled from years underground. The new safety protocols in the deep mines are slowing our work. In the past, Chrysalis would have simply quoted efficiency statistics. Instead, she asked, tell me what you experience in the mines. What would make you feel safer while maintaining good production? Sarah Chen watched from her diplomatic seat, hiding a smile as the miner's scales shifted from nervous gray to surprised blue. Soon, miners and supervisors were discussing practical solutions based on real experience, not just theoretical perfection. The princess is actually listening to us, whispered an elderly Hexadian to his neighbor, not just giving orders. Chrysalis moved through the crowd, breaking another ancient protocol by leaving her elevated platform. She carried a simple data pad, taking notes herself instead of letting her aides do it. When she didn't know something, she admitted it openly, a shocking behavior for a royal. I don't have an answer for that problem yet, she told the colony administrator worried about education resources, but let's work together to find one. The nobles watching from their traditional seats looked scandalized. Some had scales practically white with shock when Chrysalis sat cross-legged on the floor with a group of young tech workers to discuss communication systems. Later that day, in a more private meeting, her mother's advisors voiced their concerns. Your Highness, one elderly advisor said, his scales rigid with disapproval. These forums are disrupting centuries of tradition. The royal family has never directly engaged with common citizens in this manner. Chrysalis stood tall, her scales shimmering with confidence. Perhaps that's exactly why we should. How can we lead people whose lives we don't understand? She activated a holographic display, showing the changes since her forums began. Efficiency had actually improved in sectors where she'd implemented citizen-suggested solutions. More importantly, public trust in the royal family had reached historic highs. We've always led through perfect plans made from a distance, she explained. But I've learned that real leadership means getting close enough to see the imperfections and working with our people to fix them. Sarah, who had been quietly observing, watched her friend with pride. The princess who once obsessed over perfect protocol now moved with a natural grace born of genuine connection with her people. That evening, in Chrysalis' private garden, Sarah found the princess reading through citizen suggestions on her datapad. You've started quite a revolution, Sarah commented. Chrysalis looked up, her scales showing thoughtful patterns. On Earth, did your leaders always have such direct contact with citizens? Sarah laughed. We actually had to invent something called social media for leaders to seem more connected. Your open forums are much more genuine. It's strange, Chrysalis mused. All my life, I thought leadership meant standing above others, being perfect and untouchable. Now I understand it means standing with them, admitting when you're unsure, and growing together. She looked at the 3 moons rising over the capital city. The court calls it revolutionary, but it feels more like evolution. We're becoming what we always should have been. Sarah nodded. That's usually how the best changes happen. As night fell, Chryzala continued reading her citizens' messages, no longer seeking perfection, but something far more valuable: understanding. The final evaluation day arrived with all 3 moons aligned in the purple sky, a rare event that happened once every 100 years. The grand evaluation chamber, with its ancient crystal walls that had witnessed 10,000 years of succession ceremonies, was packed with nobles, officials, and for the first time ever, common citizens. Chryzala stood before the council of elders, her mother watching from the high throne. The princess's scales shimmered not with nervous energy, but with a calm confidence that made Sarah Chen smile from her diplomatic seat. Princess Chryzala, the head elder, spoke, his voice echoing through the chamber. You stand before us for your final evaluation. How do you prove your worthiness to rule? In the past, this was when candidates would list their achievements, prove their perfection. Chryzala took a different approach. I am not perfect, she declared. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Even Sarah sat up straighter. 300 years ago, I stood here listing perfect scores, perfect achievements, perfect plans, Chryzala continued. I thought that's what leadership meant. I was wrong. She turned to face the gathered crowd, breaking yet another protocol. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about understanding that perfection often gets in the way of progress. It's about listening to our people, learning from our mistakes, and growing together. Chryzala gestured to the citizens in attendance. These are not just subjects to be ruled. They are the heart of our empire. Their imperfect experiences teach more than any perfect theory. Their daily struggles matter more than any flawless protocol. She faced the council again. I used to think true understanding of leadership meant achieving perfection. Now I know it means having the courage to be imperfect, to admit when we're wrong, to learn from those we lead. The princess's scales shifted to reveal her most vulnerable colors, something no royal had ever done in public. I am not a perfect leader, but I promise to be a real one, to face our challenges together with our people, to learn from our failures, and to value progress over perfection. Complete silence filled the chamber. Then something extraordinary happened. Empress Nxvera rose from her throne, her scales showing colors no one had ever seen on her before. My daughter, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Do you know why I waited so long to approve your succession? Chryzala met her mother's eyes. Because I wasn't perfect. Because you were too perfect, the Empress corrected. Leadership isn't a destination of perfection. It's a journey of growth. You finally understand that. The Empress descended from her throne. Another unprecedented action. The true understanding of leadership isn't about knowing everything. It's about being willing to learn anything. She turned to the council. My daughter is ready. The head elder stood, his ancient scales glowing. By breaking our traditions, you have upheld their deepest meaning. By admitting imperfection, you have achieved what we truly sought. The ceremony that followed was unlike any in Hexadian history. Chryzala was crowned not on the elevated throne, but on the chamber floor, surrounded by her people. As the crown was placed on her head, she looked at Sarah, who had tears in her eyes. Later, during the celebration, the new empress found her human friend. Thank you, Chryzala said simply, for teaching me that imperfection could be my greatest strength. Sarah smiled. You did all the hard work. I just showed you a different way to look at things. Chryzala looked out at her, celebrating people, nobles and commons together, perfect protocol forgotten in genuine joy. Sometimes, she said, a different way of looking at things is exactly what an empire needs to grow.